Hi folks, and welcome to Breaking Woke, how to identify, debunk, and dismantle politically correct ideas. My name is Douglas Kruger. I'm the author of the global new book, Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. Today we're looking at an interesting charge against Western Judaeo-Christian culture and tradition. And the question is, if God is moral, and if America is good, why did they not both simply ban slavery from the outset? This charge is often used by people on the far left, radical Marxists, and aggressively atheist professors whose goal is to get rid of or undermine young people's faith. There are answers to these questions, and indeed it's quite interesting that this is used as an accusation leveled against either entity. It turns out when you begin to examine them, the answers do great credit to either entity. Now, why those two together? Why would we compare the way in which the God of the Bible and the United States of America faced this problem? Well, it turns out that they were both facing very similar dynamics concerning the question of slavery, and both solved the issue in the same sneaky, ingenious, and ultimately effective way. And understanding how this worked is incredibly important. Let's begin with the Bible. The biblical value systems and legal systems underpin much of what is today Judeo-Western culture, law, and tradition. They uphold our societies, and even in societies, westernized societies, that do not actively practice Christianity, much of the morality, much of the law is premised on biblical thinking. The Bible, of course, having been the most transmitted document in human history. So, the question becomes, why didn't God simply ban slavery from the outset? And the answer is he did. This is how it works. Consider the problem from God's perspective. You select a group of people to be your chosen representatives. They are tasked with an interesting challenge. They are supposed to spread ethical monotheism. This group was selected not as a privilege, but in fact as a duty. Their task was to spread ethical monotheism throughout the ancient world, and indeed throughout the world. However, they lived in ancient Mesopotamia, where slavery was the norm. This was the first major city, the first major civilization on earth. It's the advent of writing, it's the first big cities. It's really where ancient history, recorded history, begins. And conspicuously, God's Jewish or Hebrew people were present at the time, and his instruction to them was present at the time. So this is a religion that goes back to the dawn of recorded human history. Now, the problem that you face as God is you can't simply say to this group of people, here's your new religion with all its rules, and it explicitly states that you can't have slaves. They would reject it wholesale from the outset. What the Bible did, though, was it cleverly prohibited the possibility of owning slaves. Way back before the Ten Commandments, Moses, and the laws in Leviticus, there are what is called the Noahide laws. Now that, of course, derives from the word Noah. And as far back as these Noahide laws in Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, which predates the Ten Commandments, God provides the instruction that no one is permitted to take or to steal another person, and that the penalty for doing so is death. This precludes the possibility of obtaining slaves. And next, and this is absolutely ingenious, in fact, in a sense it gives me goosebumps, it was mandated that existing slaves also celebrate Sabbath and be permitted to rest on that day. Now, why is that relevant? What does that do structurally? Why is it significant? Well, because the entire Sabbath tradition follows this line of thinking. God made the universe. On the seventh day, God rested. You are made in the image of God. To acknowledge this fact, you too will symbolically rest on the seventh day. And so will your slaves. Now think about that for just a second. What is the logical inference? It is this. Your slaves are also made in the image of God. Now you can just imagine two ancient Jews haggling over this troublesome Torah assertion. If they're made in the image of God, then we're enslaving someone who bears God's image. Yes, that is the case. And that is why, from its foundation, the Judeo-Christian tradition has been the religion, the ethical force most opposed to slavery. In the modern world, it was not progressives, it was not atheists, it was not any other culture that began to oppose slavery. The opposition to slavery, for the first time in human history, began with evangelical Christians in England and then moved to the United States of America. Now, all of that comes from these initial verses that say, every human being made in the image of God, including your slaves. There's much to know about this topic, but there's just one more thing to touch on as we progress through it. It's worth noting that the term slave, as used in the Old Testament, does not always connote what we think of when we think of slaves. We think of plantation, we think of whips, we think of total ownership and subjugation of a human being. In many instances, the references to slaves in the Old Testament is not a reference to that. It's a reference to a bond servant. The system was as follows. If a person was unable to pay off their debt, rather than being imprisoned or incarcerated for 10 years, 20 years life, what they would do, and it was a brilliant system, was they would work off their debt to their debtor. And our modern English translation of slave encompasses that, but should actually be something more like bond servant. Of course, the Old Testament has some extremely stringent conditions for how you are supposed to treat your slave/bond servants and the humane treatment of such people. But we are not talking about slave in the traditional sense that you and I would understand that concept today. Now, go further in biblical history, and you have the preaching of Jesus talking about coming to set captives free and to proclaim liberty to the captives, and narrative tone of that nature, and everything that creates the biblical ethos and the gestalt of the language is about freeing people from slavery, and that is why it became such an important project to Christianity. Now, let's fast forward and we get to the American Founding Fathers. And this one is often leveled against the United States. And in fact, it is taken to perverse proportions by groups like the New York Times and their project to change the founding date of the United States. And they want to change it to the first date on which a slave was brought to America. Now, what does that do? What it does is to say, your entire nation is founded on shame. There is nothing good about it. That is perverse 6 ways from Sunday, and for so many reasons. Just one off the top of my head. Slavery is one of the most evil institutions we have ever had in our known world. It's one of the worst things human beings do. But it is by no means a uniquely American phenomenon. I mean, take just the word Slav. It comes from Slavic. The Slavic people were so commonly enslaved, and enslaved in such numbers, that the term slave derives from this white European group called the Slavs. Another interesting metric pointed out by historians is that more Europeans were taken into slavery into Africa by the Barbary Coast pirates than were taken from Africa to North America. So it is by no means a uniquely American or indeed a uniquely white-on-black phenomenon. It is an evil that has plagued the world since ancient history. But both God and the Founding Fathers of America solved it in the same brilliant way. So God sets the preconditions that make it impossible to maintain slavery if you follow his ethical monotheism. The American Founding Fathers did exactly the same thing. They had just come out of an 8-year-long war with the world's greatest imperial superpower, Great Britain. They had won their war, but remember that they were significantly battered, and they constructed their founding documents and built their nation in the wake of that, even as they tried to rebuild their lives, their cities, their livelihood. So they had won, but they were significantly battered. And the Founding Fathers succeeded in having all 13 original states agree to join the Union. Now think about that previously from God's perspective. How do you hand a new religion with its set of rules to a group of people and simply say, but by the way, no slavery, it's banned outright? They would reject you and it would never take root. The Founding Fathers faced the same thing and did the same thing. They invited all 13 states to join the Union, and all 13 did, including the slave-owning states. They didn't outright ban slavery, but they did this. The opening clause on which their nation is founded says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, which is the antithesis of slavery, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, that in order to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So, if you read those words carefully, they should give you goosebumps. They cannot accommodate slavery, and they cannot tolerate its continuity. But they are a brilliant way of getting the slave states to join the structure and then be under that clause. So, if they had not done it this way, they'd simply banned slavery from the outset, those slave states would have said, no thank you. They would have become their own independent nations, and there would have been no jurisdiction, no way of affecting them. Instead, they were welcomed in with a preconditional clause that ultimately made slavery impossible. Now, over time, of course, what happened was Christians in particular, this was led by conservative Christians, and ultimately the Emancipation Proclamation came from conservative Christian Republican Abraham Lincoln, looked at this and said, our Constitution says this is not acceptable, and our faith and our religion and our ethical teachings say this cannot go on. And so they stood up, they fought against it, their young men died to change it, and indeed they did change it. Both the Bible and the US Founding Fathers faced the same dynamic concerning slavery. Both solved it in the same sneaky, strategic, ultimately brilliant and effective way. They created preconditional clauses that made its continuity untenable. The question, if God is moral and if the United States is good, why did they not ban slavery from the outset? Ultimately leads to vindication and just praise for both. They both did. But they did it in an effective way that brought those people in and set the preconditions for making it impossible. I find that the average person's response to those ideas is, wow, I'd never thought of it that way. And that represents a failure of the West to teach its values and its history to its children. The Christian ethos, the Judeo-Christian Bible, was the first document responsible for banning slavery in human history. Its adherents were the most effective activist group against slavery, and the United States of America was founded on conditions that made slavery untenable in the long run. This is to their great credit.